The FIA just revealed something Red Bull did not want headlines about. And we are only days away from the Australian Grand Prix, the first race of the season. The moment when testing ends and reality begins. Buried inside official documentation are details about Ford engine deployment refinements for the RB22. Not a brand new power unit. Something more calculated. Energy maps reworked. Overtake modes adjusted. Torque delivery optimized for Melbourne stop-and-go layout. Here is why that should get your attention. After Bahrain testing, multiple rivals privately labeled the Ford RB22 the benchmark in both power and efficiency. Strong top speed. Minimal energy clipping. Relentless acceleration at the end of straights. Now imagine that engine, already considered the reference point, being fine-tuned specifically for Albert Park. More than half of decisive overtakes in modern Formula One happen either at the start or within the first lap. If you launch cleanly and deploy energy efficiently down the first straight, you control the race. If you hesitate, you chase. And chasing Red Bull is a nightmare. Even more intriguing. Max Verstappen is publicly downplaying expectations, saying they still need another step. But when the fastest engine on the grid gets smarter, smoother, more precise, that is not weakness. That is preparation. So the real question is simple. Did the FIA just confirm that Red Bull sharpened an already dominant weapon? Or are we about to see the first sign that the gap has closed? Stay with me. Because what Ford and Red Bull adjusted inside that power unit could decide the Australian Grand Prix before Turn 1 even arrives. Red Bull is not bringing a brand new Ford engine to Australia. And that is exactly why this is so dangerous. Because when the hardware stays the same, but the behavior changes, it means the foundation was already strong. The RB22 that arrives in Melbourne is essentially the same evolved machine we saw in Bahrain. Extreme side pods. A refined floor. A rear end optimized for straight line efficiency. That big step already happened. Australia is about precision. Ford and Red Bull have focused on energy deployment maps, overtake mode logic, torque delivery on corner exit. And that matters more than most people realize. Under the current regulations, power is not just about peak numbers. It is about timing. About how smoothly the electrical boost blends with the combustion engine. About how intelligently energy is released at the end of a straight. After Bahrain, several teams quietly admitted the Ford power unit looked like the benchmark. Not just fast, efficient, minimal clipping, strong acceleration even late in the deployment phase. That is already an advantage. Now imagine refining that advantage specifically for Albert Park. Melbourne is a stop-and-go circuit. Heavy braking zones. Short bursts of acceleration. Medium-length straights where deployment timing is everything. So Red Bull has adjusted torque maps to improve traction out of slow corners. Refined ERS deployment to maintain usable energy toward the end of each lap. Optimized overtake button behavior to comply with stricter FIA monitoring while preserving straight-line strength. This is not dramatic. It is surgical. And here is where the psychological layer appears. Max Verstappen has been publicly cautious. He says they still need another step. He says it will not be easy. But when a team already considered the benchmark makes targeted refinements instead of emergency changes, that is not weakness. That is control. Control over performance. Control over expectations. Because when you start from the front, you do not need revolution. You need margins. And margins in modern Formula One are everything. If the RB22 launches cleanly and deploys energy flawlessly down the first straight, track position becomes theirs to manage. And once Red Bull manages the race from the front, strategy becomes a weapon. Dirty air becomes someone else's problem. Tire degradation becomes manageable. So while there is no flashy new hardware for Australia, the real upgrade is smarter power delivery. And sometimes, smarter is more dangerous than faster. When the lights go out in Melbourne, do not just watch the speed trap numbers. Watch the first 5 seconds. Watch the way the Red Bull accelerates. Because if it looks smooth, calm, and effortless, then these so-called minor engine refinements may have just strengthened the strongest weapon on the grid. But here is where this becomes even more critical. Because refining engine maps is not just about one lap. It is about control over an entire race distance. Australia is a circuit that exposes imbalance quickly. If torque delivery is too aggressive, rear tires overheat within the first stint. If energy deployment is mistimed, you arrive at the end of the straight slightly vulnerable. If overtake mode is too conservative under FIA oversight, you lose that final few miles per hour when defending. And those small differences compound. What makes the Ford RB22 so respected right now is not just peak power. It is efficiency. During Bahrain testing, the engine appeared to maintain deployment longer into the straight without obvious clipping. That means usable energy was available deeper into acceleration zones. That alone creates pressure on rivals. Now imagine that system refined specifically for Melbourne. Stop-and-go characteristics demand strong traction out of slow corners. You need torque that is assertive, but progressive. You need electrical boost that does not spike violently. You need recovery under braking that keeps the battery healthy for the end of each lap. So what Red Bull has done is optimize how energy is harvested and redeployed across a full lap at Albert Park. More focus on exit traction. More balance between low load and high load aero modes. Smarter use of the overtake button under tighter FIA monitoring. And this is where the real tension lies. The governing body has increased scrutiny on how teams use active aero and energy deployment together. That means Red Bull must remain aggressive without appearing excessive. They must maintain straight-line strength without triggering regulatory questions. That is a narrow line to walk. But if anyone has mastered operating within narrow performance windows, it is this team. Now think about the race scenario. The lights go out. The RB22 hooks up cleanly. No hesitation. No snap of oversteer. Down the straight, energy deployment looks seamless. Not explosive. Seamless. Ferrari cannot quite edge alongside. Mercedes cannot find the extra surge. From that point forward, Red Bull controls the tempo. And when they control tempo, they control tire life. They control pit windows. They control strategy flow. But if even a slight vulnerability appears, if the refined deployment is marginally softer under FIA constraints, the chasing pack will sense it immediately. And when Ferrari or Mercedes senses weakness, they attack relentlessly. This is why the so-called secret upgrades are not about a new turbo or a redesigned combustion chamber. They are about intelligence. About extracting maximum efficiency from an already strong platform. About ensuring the engine behaves perfectly under race stress. Sometimes, dominance is not about being louder. It is about being smoother. And if the Ford RB22 delivers that smooth, relentless acceleration in Melbourne, then the message to the rest of the grid will be clear. Red Bull did not need a revolution. They just made the benchmark even harder to beat. When the lights go out in Australia, watch the first stint carefully. Because that is where we will discover whether these subtle engine refinements quietly secured another early advantage, or whether the fight at the front is closer than anyone expected. And this is where the bigger championship picture begins to form. Because Australia is not just about winning race 1. It is about sending a message. Red Bull understands something most teams learn the hard way. The first race does not decide the title. But it defines perception. If the RB22 arrives in Melbourne and immediately shows smooth, dominant acceleration, the psychological impact is enormous. Rivals start questioning their own winter development. Engineers begin chasing ghosts in the data. Drivers feel pressure before race 2 even begins. That is how dominance starts. Not with a dramatic headline, but with quiet control. Now consider the alternative. If the refined Ford engine maps are even slightly conservative under the new FIA monitoring. If the overtake mode logic has been softened just enough to avoid scrutiny. If deployment feels a fraction less aggressive at the end of the straight. Then Ferrari and Mercedes will notice. They will push harder in qualifying. They will attack in the first stint. And suddenly, Red Bull is no longer dictating. They are defending. That shift matters. Because Red Bull's greatest strength over the past seasons has not just been speed. It has been strategic authority. When they lead, they dictate tire pace. They choose pit windows. They force rivals into undercuts that rarely work. But all of that begins with clean traction and efficient energy use. The Ford RB22 has already been labeled the benchmark in efficiency. Minimal clipping. Strong mid-range pull. Relentless acceleration deep into straights. If those traits remain intact, and the Melbourne-specific refinements enhance traction without sacrificing top-end deployment, then Red Bull's advantage compounds. Not explosively, but steadily. And steady dominance is the hardest to beat. Because it leaves no obvious weakness to attack. There is also a long-term layer here. The closer we move toward the next power unit era, the more every calibration decision becomes strategic. Teams are not just racing the present. They are validating philosophies for the future. If Ford and Red Bull prove they can refine software, manage energy intelligently, and stay ahead under tighter oversight, that builds confidence internally for what comes next. And confidence fuels development aggression. But none of that matters if the launch falters. If traction is inconsistent. If deployment fades late in a stint. Melbourne will compress all of this into a handful of decisive moments. The first 5 seconds. The first straight. The first defensive maneuver. And then the long-run phase. If the RB22 looks composed, stable, and efficient across those phases, the message to the grid is unmistakable. Red Bull did not need a radical upgrade. They just perfected what was already strong. But if there is even a hint of vulnerability, even a small opening, the championship narrative shifts immediately. Because Ferrari looks hungry, Mercedes looks refined, and margins at the front are thinner than ever. So when the lights go out in Australia, watch more than just who leads. Watch how they lead. Watch how effortlessly the Ford engine pulls through each gear. Watch whether energy deployment feels endless. Because sometimes the most powerful statement in Formula One is not a dramatic new part. It is a quiet confirmation that the benchmark just became smarter. And if that is what we see in Melbourne, then the rest of the season may already have its tone set before the checkered flag even falls.